All right, great. Thank you, everyone. I'm sure folks are still going to continue to trickle in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, hello, and thank you for attending the Equitable Growth Grantee Conference and for attending this 90-minute session on mobility and racial inequality, which, given our lineup today, promises to be really great. My name is Stephen Brown. I'm Equitable Growth's relatively new Director of Economic Mobility, and I'll be chairing this session today. Equitable Growth Grantee Conference is intended to provide opportunities for grantees to present and receive feedback on research and to engage in professional development activities. We ask all participants to act with intellectual and professional integrity and to allow for an environment where everyone can freely participate. We expect all participants to engage in civil and respectful discourse at all times. Thank you. In the interest of time, and we have a packed agenda, and so we want to save time for questions, we will not be doing bios, but if you're interested in learning more about participants, we'll send out a link with more details. Our presenters will speak in the following order. We will start with Jonathan Fisher of Equitable Growth, who will present co-authored work on intergenerational mobility using income, consumption, and wealth. He'll be followed by a presentation from Lauren Brinkley Rubenstein of the University of North Carolina, who will present co-authored work on exploring the intersections between wealth, health, and structural racism. Those presentations will be followed by Fabian Pfeffer of the University of Michigan, who will then respond to these papers and presentations. After that, we'll have Andrew Garin of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, who will present co-authored work titled "Whether the Arsenal of Democracy and Engine of Mobility, Public Investment and Roots of Mid-Century Manufacturing Quality." And Luca Perdoni of the University of Edinburgh will present co-authored work on the effects of federal redlining maps and novel estimation strategy. And then finally, Trevon Logan of the Ohio State University will then respond to these papers. And after that, each presentation will be about 10 minutes, and discussants will have about 15 minutes to follow up after the second and fourth presentations. So 2 presentations followed by 1 discussant, then 2 and followed by 1. I'll be monitoring time and will be strict about keeping it to allow all the presenters their allotted times. We should have about 20 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. You can ask questions in the Q&A box in the event page. So that's on the event page, the event page, which I will monitor. Given respect for time, I will limit the questions during the presentations to particularly pertinent clarifying ones, and we'll save other Q&A questions for time at the end. Finally, we do have a few reports thus far, some technical challenges from our initial sessions earlier today. Please let me and the CVent support team know if you're having issues as well, and we'll try to address them. And if not, we'll make note of them in hopes that things go more swimmingly the rest of the week. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jonathan Fisher of Equitable Growth. Jonathan, take it away.
Thanks, Stephen. Normally this is the time where I'd say thanks for inviting me, but I did invite myself. So I want to thank myself for inviting me to present here. This is joint work with David Johnson on intergenerational mobility using income, consumption, and wealth. And intergenerational mobility is one of the key issues of our time. We have the concern that children born to low-income families don't have the opportunity to get higher income, to move up the distribution, and also worry about stickiness at the top, that children born to higher income, higher wealth, higher consumption families are more likely to stay there. And so we want to look at this issue of intergenerational mobility using income, consumption, and wealth. And each measure tells us something individually about the level of stickiness of how much intergenerational mobility there is. Most of the research focuses on income, in part just because that's more available. Consumption is also interesting. If we only have snapshots of income, maybe consumption gives us a better measure of permanent income or of well-being. And then wealth is interesting because it's the most unequally distributed. It exhibits the highest inequality, much higher than income and consumption. And it's, you can also think it's more easily transferred between generations. Parents can just do transfers, can give transfers to children, and grandparents can. So maybe there's a role there of just direct transfers that creates this intergenerational correlation in wealth above income and consumption. So let me give you a quick summary of what our contributions are. There is large literature on this. We're going to measure income, consumption, and wealth for the same parent-offspring pairs. And so one of our questions is mobility in income greater or less than consumption and wealth? And we think really the best way to do that is to use the same parent-offspring pairs. And so we know that if there is a difference, it's not coming from sample differences. It really is becoming because of the different measure of what, is coming from differences in the three measures themselves. We then measure each when the offspring are teenagers, 14 to 18 years old, living in the home. Again, we think part of the importance is this investment in human capital, this investment in children, investment in neighborhoods that's important. And so we want to measure all three when the children are living in the home. Previous research would sometimes measure wealth or consumption or even income when the children are adults. And so that's really capturing something different. We really want to capture this investment in kids when they're in the household. So we want when the kids are in the household. And then we're going to measure the resources for the offspring when they're adults at the same ages, from 31 to 35 years old. Again, if we measure income at 31 to 35, but we measure wealth at a later age, well, we're getting into life cycle differences. So we want to measure all three resources at the same time when they're living with their parents and at the same ages as adults. We're going to use one absolute mobility measure, just the percent of offspring with resources exceeding their parents. Then we have three relative mobility measures. Today, I'm only going to show you the rank slope, but the results are similar across these intergenerational mobility measures. And then we're also going to look at differences by characteristics of the parents and characteristics of the offspring. Today, I'm just going to focus on race, just in the interest of time. To do this, we're going to use the panel study of income dynamics. It's been following the same respondents and their descendants since 1968. So we have this long panel, 50 years of data of parents, grandparents, children, grandchildren. The PSID measures before tax income every wave, and we supplement the PSID by imputing total consumption for all waves and imputing net wealth when it's not reported. And so then we have 50 years of income, consumption, and wealth for all families. So now I'm just going to turn to the results, and we'll have to dig into kind of the details on measurement separately when we have the full paper. So I want to focus first on our absolute mobility result. So I'm going to focus here on income. And we look at how it changes by birth cohort. So if we look at this far left dot for income, it says that for children born around 1958, around 62% of them had higher income at ages 31 to 35 than their parents had when the kids were 14 to 18 years old. So 62% had this upward mobility. And what we also compared to is this Chetty et al. Research that did not actually link kids to their parents, but had some assumptions to estimate this intergenerational mobility. And what we do is we see very similar level and trends for income from the cohorts that overlap, where we see decreasing absolute mobility until the 1981 cohort, our last one, where it's right around 53% of children have higher income than their parents. And so we see this decreasing income absolute mobility. Now, what we want to do is, Chetty et al. And other research has not looked at this for consumption and wealth. And, in our oldest cohort, we see much higher upward consumption mobility. Almost 80% of kids had higher consumption than their parents, but it's falling much faster. That by our 1981 cohort, it's actually below income. It's and below 50% of kids. And so we see much faster fall in absolute mobility and consumption and lower wealth, absolute mobility, and also a faster fall than consumption. It goes from 50% for wealth to below 30% for our youngest cohort. But the consistent story is falling absolute mobility. Children are just less likely to do better than their parents in younger generations than in older generations. Next, we want to turn to our relative mobility measures. And here the conclusion is we find a stronger correlation for income than consumption and then for wealth. So how do we interpret this? How do we interpret this figure? Is we first put children and parents into deciles. So we rank them. And so here we've got the bottom, right here, we've got the bottom 10% of parents on the x-axis at the 1. So this is the children whose parents were in the bottom 10% of the income of the parent income distribution. And for consumption, on average, these kids, or for income, on average, these kids ended up around the 30th percentile, around the 32nd for consumption, and almost to the 40th, around the 39th for wealth. So that, this is what the dots are telling us. And then we plot it across all the deciles. And so up here is the top decile, children whose parents were in the top decile of wealth. They ended up around the 62nd, 63rd percentile on average as adults. And so what we see is this flatter blue line for wealth, suggesting that there's a lower slope or a lower correlation between parental wealth and offspring wealth. The correlation is strongest for income, which means there's a stronger relationship between parent income and offspring income. Stated in the opposite, we can say there's more mobility for wealth than there is for consumption or income. And so, we take away from this is that, despite the high wealth inequality, it actually has the higher mobility than income or consumption. Consumption mobility is slightly lower. The rank is slightly lower or slightly higher mobility for consumption. The last thing I want to do today is look at differences by race. We look at more characteristics in the paper, but just for the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on race differences. So I've got 3, figures here for income, consumption, and wealth. And let's focus first on income. And what this, what I first highlight here is that for the average white offspring whose parents are in the bottom income decile when they're teenagers, they end up around the 37th percentile as an adult. The average black offspring born into the bottom income decile ends up around the 28th percentile as an adult. So we see this shift down, where this intercept shift down for income, where the black offspring end up lower in the distribution. We also see this at the top of the distribution. Black offspring born into the top decile, parents who are in the top 10%, the average black offspring only ends up around the 57th, 75th for the white offspring. So we see this big difference in the intercept and a difference in the slope. Then we can also see this also is very similar patterns for wealth and consumption, where we got this lower intercept, lower slope for black children. And again, for wealth, I want to highlight, I know I'm running low on time, is very little slope for black offspring for wealth. What I want to reiterate or state is that this is not a causal effect of being black. This is, part of the institutions, the policies, the structures in the United States that give less opportunity for low-income black children to move up, and less ability for high, black children who grow up in higher income households, higher wealth, higher consumption households to reproduce, to reproduce that. So this is part of the structural racism in the United States is evidenced here in income, consumption, and wealth. So the full working paper will be available in early 2023, where we look at differences by sex and race, by parental education. So thank you.
All right, thank you for that presentation, Jonathan. That was really, really interesting. And so next up, it does not appear that Lauren will be able to join us today. And so I think I am handing the mic over to Fabian. Is that right? Oh, you're on mute.
I think that's right. I received a presentation by Lauren, but I don't think for me to present, at least I'm not ready to do that. So if she joins later, I'm happy to give my comments on their slides later too. So let's jump to the comments for Jonathan. I have enough time, but I probably don't even need the full time. It's a really excellent paper. And once it comes out, I would encourage everyone to read it. Jonathan and David have been really innovative in touching upon the holy trinity of economic well-being, consumption, income, and wealth at the same time. And this is sort of their most ambitious venture into the intergenerational literature and bring all of these three measures to bear, which I think provides for some really interesting insights. So I have a few points on strengths and questions on what else could be done to convince us of this. But overall, I will say I see lots of indications of a clear story, and also I have some validation that I'm equipped to give today. So, of course, one of the big advantages, as Jonathan said, is that they're using the same sample, which also means the same age restrictions for all three measures. And that's a strength if we're comparing the same people at the same stages of their life course for all three measures. In fact, and I'm not sure about this, but I'll just give it to Jonathan and David as an idea. I wonder, once we have the same households, whether we may also be interested in learning a bit about the sort of residual correlation in each of these measures. So, for example, controlling for income and consumption, what is the residual correlation in wealth? Or in other words, is there an independent transmission of wealth holding other types of transmissions constant that we may be interested in? Same for income and consumption. I think theoretically, that may be less of an interesting estimate, but it could still be one that's worth discussing. So that's sort of something that only they can do by using this kind of sample for the same people at the same times. At the same time, the advantage that they present could also be interpreted in some sense as a disadvantage. And that's a different perspective that would ask, do we really want to look at intergenerational correlation in these three different measures at the exact same ages? Or should we adjust the ages by measure we look at? So, for example, there is of course, as the authors know and cite, there's very long literature on when to measure income over how many years, and when sort of the intergenerational correlation in income stabilizes. And their age structure, I think, is well attuned to yielding valid estimates of intergenerational income mobility. So it could be at age 40, as they have, that's a great point. At the same time, you could ask, for example, for wealth, whether that's really the age we want to look at if we're interested in the overall correlation or intergenerational stability in wealth. Perhaps we want to look at wealth at later ages. Perhaps we want to look at wealth before retirement. So, of course, this is sort of a conceptual question, but I just want to give the other spin on what they describe as the main advantage, that there could also be a perspective that says perhaps these intergenerational transmissions occur at different stages of the life course, and your models should be accounting for that. And there are two or three more sort of technical issues that I want to bring up briefly that in some ways also complicate the direct comparison of mobility estimates across these three measures. Some apply for all kinds of approaches, some apply for just some of the estimation approaches they have. For example, the elasticities, which you didn't see today, but they're in the paper and also quite interesting, but the elasticities are impacted by the degree of inequality. And as Jonathan said, for example, wealth inequality is just so much more unequally distributed that would push the elasticity in a certain way, namely lower elasticity or higher elasticity, that makes it also difficult to compare across these three measures. But perhaps one sort of broader question I had was about something that Jonathan didn't go into a whole lot, but that I know was a tremendous amount of effort and will be a tremendous contribution to the literature. And that is that they had to rely on imputations for some of these measures. So while the PSID in most recent years has full-fledged measures of income, consumption, and wealth, the Holy Trinity, as you go back in time, consumption and wealth were not collected in the same kind of full-fledged approach. As they moved their time window backwards, therefore, they rely more heavily on imputations, work that they've done for other papers too. That's been quite impressive and I think convincing. At the same time, of course, imputed measures may produce different kinds of estimates than non-imputed measures. And that's not quite clear in the analysis as they're presented. What I would love to see is to separate your estimates for imputed measures and unimputed measures, just to see whether there is a difference. I think, there are a variety of reasons why we may think that the imputations are not perfect enough to provide unbiased measures. And why this is important is that since income, consumption, and wealth are impacted differently from missingness patterns, the estimates are impacted differently, and especially as you compare the different ages. So as you look at different age groups, for income, you're always drawing on observed income measures. For consumption, you're drawing on observed income measures for the most recent years, but not prior. And for wealth, sort of in between. So that may well be biasing, the sort of share of imputed information across these three measures may be biasing these direct comparisons in the degree of intergenerational mobility across these measures. So that's something I'd be really interested in, and I think you could show some evidence on whether the imputations make a difference. One or two more technical things, and then I'll just wrap up with a validation. I was also really interested in some of the findings that sort of Jonathan went over quickly, and that is that there is more upward mobility in consumption. So thinking about this substantively, it's sort of interesting that if we, the story is in many parts one of doom and gloom, where today's children are much less likely to attain the status or go above the status of their parents than they were before. So there are pronounced patterns of downward mobility. We knew that for income based on Chetty, and this is nicely replicated here, we then also now know that for wealth, even more pronounced patterns of downward mobility, and it's gotten even worse over time too. But for consumption, that may be the one hope we can have, that more children consume more than their parents did. And here I'm sort of asking for the substantive conclusion. And I think that really depends on what is in the consumption measure. So are children consuming more in the form of more holiday trips and cruise ship travel? Or are they consuming more because life became more important? And many of what used to be public investments are now private investments. Think of the cost for education, for example. That would be really interesting sort of to add as a context to help us interpret these trends in consumption patterns across generations. Allow me one more technical thing. I hope I don't bore everyone to death. Something that was not presented as centrally, but is also a quite interesting contribution of this paper is that besides the elasticities and the rank slopes and the absolute mobility measures, they also provide Gini mobility measures that haven't been used as often, but have a quite intuitive interpretation. And they're really interesting. One sort of technical question I have for the authors is, I suspect that these Gini mobility measures have the same limitations that the Gini coefficient has when it comes to measures that have negative values. So all of you know the Gini coefficient as being bounded between 0 and 1, with 1 being perfect inequality. That only applies to measures without negative values. The Gini coefficient is actually not bounded at 1 if they're negative values, as we have in wealth. So I wonder whether that may be an issue and whether that also makes the direct comparison complicated. Okay, so those were admittedly also some of the more technical responses, but I think it's a really strong paper already, and it really will help us understand this topic much more. And one of the reasons why I like it too, I will admit, is that it also lines up nicely with research that I and collaborators, especially Sasha Killewald, have done. And I will show you, I'm not trying to steal anyone's thunder, but it really is striking to me how well the estimates line up. So this is very similar to what Jonathan showed you, sort of the rank correlation in wealth. We also have parents' wealth on the x-axis and children's wealth on the y-axis. And you see a rank slope coefficient that is actually significantly higher for us than it is for David and Jonathan. So that's something we can probably discuss offline too, but we think that it is, as I signaled in the beginning, really important to measure wealth at later ages too, and the correlation coefficient goes up significantly, which it doesn't for them. And that, again, for me, brings up this question about the imputations. But the racial difference here, which is important, is nearly perfectly reproduced. One aspect that I think is important here to demonstrate also is that these are the slopes, but I think what's still hidden here is the distribution of these two groups across the wealth distribution. And of course, once you scale this proportionally, you see that most Black children in the US grow up in the bottom half of the wealth distribution. So in that sense, the slope out here is applies to very few people, and most of the immobility and even downward mobility occurs for Black children here at the bottom. And in fact, another way to show this, and I think Jonathan has seen this, but I want to show you because I think it's an interesting way to show it, is, if I find it, give me 1 second, please, is this. This is, of course, something that we stole from a New York Times visualization approach of Chetty's data. We have applied that to our wealth data, and it shows the intergenerational mobility by race. Here, children growing up in the middle of the wealth distribution asking to which quintile they move. And you also see these pronounced patterns of downward mobility among Black children. And you could sort of cycle through and look at this for different origin quintiles, which is, as I just signaled, perhaps not the best way to do it. And then a more interesting way that takes into account population redistribution would rescale this. And I think this is sort of where the issue of institutional racism and structural racism comes out more clearly. You see that most Black children begin in the bottom half or in the bottom 40% of the wealth distribution. A lot of them move in terms of their own adult wealth. However, you see that the racial gaps are very well maintained. And of course, that is a crucial aspect of the wealth distribution in this country, that both on the left side here, it is a reflection of longstanding processes of racism and exclusion. But in the middle, you see that these processes continue today to maintain the highly racialized wealth structure. So that's sort of a way to look at it that illustrates some of the patterns that Jonathan and David also find. And with that, I think I would rather hand this over, or I'll show you one more thing. And this is interesting because we had presented a paper at PAA, but I think that was long after Jonathan and David had already put this together, but without me knowing, I had replicated one of their figures from a very different approach. So this is also what Jonathan showed you. And we estimated downward mobility, absolute mobility in wealth. And And the lines here are very, very similar to that of David and Jonathan, using a very different kind of approach of constructing a sample. In our case, we constructed a sample that wanted to maximize the similarity in ages across generations. So we wanted to look at age 45 for parents and age 45 for kids. And we come up with basically the exact same results. So I think that makes me hopeful that this finding of very pronounced downward mobility in wealth is well replicated, is stable, and I closed 1 second too early. And also it's gotten worse over time. So more downward mobility over time, and more downward mobility here, although that is something that Jonathan also discusses in the paper. It is, of course, much easier to be downwardly mobile if you have somewhere down to go. So there is a sort of flooring effect for Black households in the country that shows up here. So with that, unless our Lauren will log in, I'm happy to rejoin again, but I wanted to congratulate Jonathan and David for a really excellent paper, and I think we are all looking forward to seeing it in 2023.
Thank you for that. So actually, it turns out that Zaire Cullins is here to present on their paper with Lauren. So I will turn the floor over to Zaire. You'll have 10 minutes. And if you're able to stay on, Fabian, it would be helpful if you could revisit some of your comments you were going to share about their paper at the end during Q&A. And if not, just message me and we can figure something else out. But right now, we'll just turn it over to Zaire. Thank you for being able to join. I apologize about the confusion, but you have 10 minutes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for dealing with all of the confusion that we've been having today. I am Zaire Cullins. I am a research assistant at the University of North Carolina in the School of Medicine, and I also work in Dr. Lauren Brinkley-Rubenstein's lab as the research assistant. And I do apologize for not being Lauren, but I'm happy to present our paper to you today. Our paper explores the intersections between wealth, health, and structural racism, as our lab does investigate the public health implications of both incarceration and post-incarceration within typically marginalized populations. And I'm so sorry, I'm having some internet issues for some reason. Okay. So just to give you a little roadmap of where our presentation will be going, we will be talking about how our lab has decided to define structural racism, how we've decided to measure structural racism, and giving examples of the measures of structural racism that we will be talking about. Just to kind of get it started, our team is aware that structural racism is a very popular topic that okay. So just to get us started, our team is aware that structural racism is a very in vogue topic to investigate, especially in the field of public health. And we have found that a lot of papers dealing with structural racism disagree on the definition. So going off of a paper that was recently released by Drs. Lorraine Dean and Roland Thorpe Jr., we we'll talk about how structural racism has often been conflated with institutional racism and kind of defining what we believe the differences to be. So we see institutional racism the same way as Drs. Dean and Thorpe do, which is that they are the policies and practices that a singular institution puts in place that helps to foster racial discrimination. Whereas structural racism is the institutions and their discriminatory policies in totality. So as you can see, we did decide to use the definition given by Dr. Zinzi Bailey, which states that structural racism is the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems. And they go on to list some of these systems. So our team, while we were looking through these definitions, we also saw there were differences in how people decided to measure structural racism. The single measure approach is very popular, and we wanted to see if the single measure approach was actually effective in measuring structural racism, and if there was one single measure that supersedes all other single measures in terms of structural racism. Secondly, we wanted to see if there was an index approach that we could use to measure structural racism, as we see that it exists at the intersection of all systems. And finally, we wanted to see if using historical measures of racism, we can utilize them as a gauge for structural racism that we see in the present. So for our single measures, these are just some examples that we've used in our working paper. The single measure approach is very popular in structural racism literature, with scholars typically choosing to focus on the racial wealth gap and on residential segregation. We believe most single measures to be linked, as the racial wealth gap is associated with residential segregation and vice versa. As a lab that studies incarceration, we also believe that incarceration is a very important measure of structural racism, as we do see disparities in races that are represented within our carceral systems. Incarceration also influences the racial wealth gap and residential segregation, but with the wealth gap, it's typically being seen as incarcerated persons post-release are often denied positions or jobs due to their incarcerated history, or even voter disenfranchisement for those that were convicted of felonies. And we also know that incarceration is linked to both negative short-term and long-term physical and mental health impacts. We also see that residential segregation impacts housing, employment, and health outcomes, as the redlining that took place in the 20th century placed historically marginalized groups in areas of high pollution, food insecurity, that also negatively impacted their health. As stated, we do believe that structural racism intersects with all facets of life, so we also decided to look at an index approach. This led us to the first index approach, which we kind of covered on the previous slide, of looking at the incarceration rate, the residential segregation, and racial income gap, to see if this would be an accurate representation of structural racism. We also wanted to look at the effects of redlining. As we know, redlining is associated with kidney disease and other chronic illnesses, along with felony convictions, which we have previously said is linked to voter disenfranchisement, but also impacts healthcare and the wealth gap, while also looking at the infant mortality rate, which is associated with a lower educational achievement, lower median household income, lower employment or higher underemployment, as well as higher incarceration rates. For our third index, we propose to look at the exposure to violence, which can worsen mental health outcomes and is seen more in areas of historically marginalized groups and communities. We also wanted to look at food insecurity and the racial wealth gap, as both of these have associations with the decline in physical health and as well as incarceration rates. For historical measures, our team was super interested in looking at how previous racist acts and statistics could be used to show structural racism that exists in our present. First, we wanted to look at the number of lynchings that happened in a particular area, the number of enslaved persons that were held in a particular area, and any kind of redlining measures or indexes that we could find. We've seen through literature that the number of lynchings were higher in areas that were more segregated, and it's also linked to more racial segregation in our present, as well as the number of enslaved persons that were held in a particular area. If one area had a large amount of enslaved persons prior to the abolition of slavery, there's more likely to be more Black people in that community. And we also wanted to look at redlining, as redlining tends to have a negative impact on communities in the 20th century and even now, hundreds of years later, in terms of there being more prevalence of chronic illnesses, more food insecurity, and a lack of access to healthcare, employment, and education. And these are acknowledgements to our funders, and we'd like to thank our PIs and our co-investigator team.
Thank you, Zaire, for that really interesting presentation. And I'm glad we were able to get you in. I'm sorry about the confusion that resulted. And so next up in the presentation, we have, we're going to turn to Andrew Garin of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who will present on work titled, "Was the Arsenal of Democracy an Engine of Mobility? Public Investment and the Roots of Mid-Century Manufacturing Opportunity." Andrew, turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me be here. It's been kind of great to be a part of this session with really interesting papers. So in this project, which is joint with Jonathan Rothbaum at the Census Bureau, we're going to kind of start from that observation that mobility has been declining, and there's been a kind of hollowing out of kind of good blue-collar work opportunity that help people climb the ladder, and kind of take it from a historical perspective and think about, we see this decline over the last half of the 20th century. Think a little bit about, well, how did we get there to this place of upward mobility in the first place? And what role did policy play? And so, thinking about, the kind of core question is thinking about, was mid-century manufacturing. We're going to focus on that kind of disappearance of the blue-collar, high-wage manufacturing job and what that means for mobility by rewinding and asking, how important was access, and specific locally access to kind of high-wage manufacturing employment, to economic opportunity in the middle of the 20th century, and kind of more fundamentally, what led that to come about? Was that something that was always there, or was that something that kind of was the direct product of government interventions earlier in the 20th century? And the focal event that we're going to study here is World War II. Which was, among many other things, one of the largest economic policy interventions that's ever occurred in US history. And so we're going to focus here on one specific aspect of the economic mobilization, which kind of creates a nice experimental setting, which is the construction of large new industrial plants paid for with public money in kind of unusual places during World War II. And we want to see how kind of building these plants kind of to meet the war need, to deal with kind of these short-run exigencies, in turn affected first like what local labor markets looked like later in the post-war era and beyond, and then what it actually meant for the people who were growing up there and their long-run trajectories. So, in a nutshell, World War II, many things happened during World War II, but one of them that's kind of always been very kind of amazing to me is the fact that the US fully tripled its manufacturing output in the period from 1939 to 1942. And in the process, to do that required an unprecedented capital expansion in the United States. It required a kind of campaign of manufacturing plant construction at a scale that had never been seen before, and honestly has not been repeated in history. Now, there's an extent to which at the beginning, there are companies that were being given contracts where they said, write off whatever you need to build. But at the end of the day, to reach that scale in a way that was sustainable and consistent with the war goals, plants needed to be built outside of Detroit and outside of Chicago, in places that were secure and making use of kind of resources that wouldn't be used otherwise but were available. And so the military prioritized building new facilities in secure locations that were away from major manufacturing hubs, and therefore wouldn't put all the eggs in one basket if there was a blackout or a bombing raid. But in places that kind of, you see this again and again in these kind of documents, that they need to have, enough people hanging around, enough access to kind of basic land and electricity and water to run a factory. So you can't just put them in the desert. The problem here is they really wanted companies to build these plants. Companies did not want to build plants in those places. That's not really the natural place for them to locate a manufacturing plant, away from their hubs, away from kind of the center of where everything is. And so the result is that the only way in the end the government was able to build these plants is if they paid for them themselves. And so there's this class of plants that was built entirely with public money, where the structure, the government just paid for the whole thing and owned it and rented it for $1 a year to whoever was kind of contracted to make the airplanes or the tanks. And at the end of the war, they would sell these off at whatever price people would take it. But it was the government fully assumed the risk of whatever loss in value they would occur. And so, here's a kind of famous example, which is the Willow Run bomber plant in Ypsilanti in Washtenaw County. What was there before was nothing really. I mean, it was kind of in Michigan, kind of between other industrial places, but itself was very rural. And the only reason it was chosen wasn't because it was a big factory town that was on the rise, but because Henry Ford had some rural land that was used for a boys' camp to build character. And when he had been resistant to supporting the war early on, and so when the US kind of was attacked in Pearl Harbor, he donated this as a place to build a plant when he knew the government was looking for big tracts of land that you could have an airport to build an airplane plant as a sign of goodwill. And so what you get is that all these plants are built outside of manufacturing hubs in kind of unusual locations with kind of spare workforces and land. And the reasons that they were chosen over other locations were for these idiosyncratic short-run factors that were really about kind of making things work during the war and not about long-run economic planning or any forecast to how these regions would evolve over time. So how are we going to study these? A big part of this is a giant data collection effort where first we kind of, one of the great things about World War II is there are amazing records that are declassified. So you can see the list of every plant and every investment that was made. We're going to take that, kind of bring it up to the county level to study the kind of big public new plants that we're going to focus on those that were kind of newly constructed with public money. Then we're going to look first at county level outcomes from a variety of sources, going from 1900 to beyond 2000. And then to study, we're going to want to study not just what it did to places, but to the people who lived there. And so we're going to use two different kind of pretty novel data sources. So one is we're going to use Social Security records linked to CPS records, linked to place of birth records that are going to let us see where people lived before World War II, and then look at their outcomes. We're going to know in Social Security not where they live, but what they were earning from 1978 to 1990, and then we're actually going to see them in the CPS late in adulthood, at kind of from 1990 onwards in at least 1 year, so we can see their educational status. And we're going to combine that with work that my co-author John Rothblum has done, linking the 1940 census to 1970s tax returns to kind of study Chetty Hendren style measures of intergenerational mobility. But instead of being from like the 90s to the 2000s, it's going to be from 1940 to the 1970s. And so we can look at where people were living in 1940, then a plant opens there kind of as a shock to them, kind of they're living there. And then we're going to compare somebody where the plant opens to where it doesn't. And we're going to see what's happening to them in terms of their income ranking, 30, 40 years later. And so how are we going to compare this? We're basically based on these historical documents. We're going to take the places that got these plants, and we're going to kind of take some basic factors. You can't locate a plant in the middle of the desert. So we're going to kind of make a propensity score about kind of electricity access, size of the local workforce in 1940, and kind of other measures of kind of basic city size. Once you adjust for that, we're going to, we show in the paper that it looks like those places that were chosen versus not was pretty random. There's really good covariate balance. So first, let's see what happens in the county kind of panel over time. To look at that. Okay, so what we're looking here, this is kind of in a difference in differences framework. Though it turns out that we don't need to do difference in differences because it would be a pretty balanced over time. But you can see that manufacturing expands in terms of the number of employees and output pretty dramatically immediately. And it's really persistent. These counties that got these plants had like 20% more employees throughout the rest of the 20th century. When you look at what kind of jobs were there, the average productivity and the average wage at manufacturing jobs in counties where these plants opened were just way higher than in other counties. There was like 10% higher, and they remained these higher paying jobs. Now, this is at the county level, so we can't tell if this is that these were higher skilled jobs that were recruiting in high wage types of people, or if this was just kind of a union effect, which it could have been, because we know that these industries that were involved in war production had 80 to 100% unionization rates at the end of the war, kind of from historical documents. The places that got these became permanently bigger. And so we see that, median male earnings across sectors was 4.5% higher, family incomes were 4% higher. We don't see the kind of same earnings effects for women. So the question then is what about the kids who are growing up there? And here we're going to really kind of just do the comparison of people born in one versus another, and then have a plant dropped on them. And then we're going to see what they earned as adults, no matter where they lived, unconditional on that. And so when we look kind of across each of the time periods, we see when these kids who were born 1922 to 1940, so they were 18 or under in 1940 at the outset of the war, when we see them kind of late in their careers in the 1970s and 1980s, even at that point, having a plant having opened when you were a kid means you're earning 3% more a year. We don't see that for women, it's only for men. It's kind of consistent with what we know about manufacturing as a potential driver of this. When we look at differences by race, so blue is for Black men and red, the maroon is for white men. And what you can see is that the effects on white men kind of mimic the overall effect, because they're the majority of the sample that we see in what we were able to link. The effects are a lot bigger for Black men, though there's also this kind of reduced probability of working, which means that there's this compositional effect that could potentially be driving it. But once we a lot of that lower probability of working seems to be driven by early retirements. When you get rid of the oldest cohorts, you see the same wage effect without as much of that kind of participation effect. So the selection stuff may not be as much of a concern. You see the effects are largest for when we link to the 1940 census to people whose parents were lower in the income distribution or weren't matched to parents with earnings at all. We see that again in John Rothbaum's data, that you move kind of up a 1 percentile rank if you had low earnings parents in 1940, but not above. We don't seem to find that education is really what's going on. We see small effects that aren't very robust and aren't large enough to explain the earnings effects. But what we do see is that people, if on the left is a wage effect, on the right-hand side, what we can see here is that 1/3 of the effect is just explained by the industry premium, but we can see what industry you're working in. And just the industry you're working on and knowing kind of what their page premiums is from the old industry premium literature suggests that just knowing what industry, not even which firm, is enough to predict 1/3 of your wage increase. And then if we look at the average coworker pay, where you're working seems to explain everything. So just to wrap up, what we find here, we're still working to kind of disentangle some of these mechanisms here, but what we see is that these one-time investments during World War II had these long-run effects on places, and that mattered for the people who lived there. And the mechanism for why it mattered really seems to be this access to high-paying jobs as you're an adult. I mean, that's consistent with what we know about unions during this period. That story is important because it suggests, in the modern era, building plants that aren't unionized may not have the same benefits for upward mobility if they're not creating in themselves these kind of high wage work opportunities that the plants in the World War II era were creating for the people who lived there. So thanks. Sorry to run a little over.
Thank you, Andrew. And for the final presentation, we'll have Luca Perdoni of the University of Edinburgh. Over to you, Luca.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Luca. I have just finished my PhD at Yale and I started a new job at the University of Edinburgh. Very happy to present this project here, since having the support of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth was fundamental throughout the last year of my PhD. In this project, we propose a new empirical approach to estimate the causal effects of the so-called federal redlining maps. And this project started as joint work with my late classmate and friend, Disa Hinso. So sharing part of Disa's work with you today, it's a way of remembering her that I know she would appreciate. So let's start. Redlining is the term used in the United States to indicate the systematic denial of credit to residents of a community. In the late 1930s, a federal agency drew residential security maps in more than 200 American cities, and these maps were meant to summarize the financial risk of granting mortgages in different residential areas. Here I'm showing an example, is the map for New Haven in Connecticut. American neighborhoods were rated with a 4-level scale, so the possible grades were either A, B, C, or D. And each grade was paired with a color. So for example, top-tier neighborhoods were colored in green, then we have the blue, then the yellow, while the ones with the lowest evaluations were highlighted in red. Today, there's a widespread belief that the lowest grades reduced credit access, increased borrowing costs, which in turn led to overall urban disinvestment. It is important to acknowledge that every neighborhood was described in a standardized form that often included racist considerations. In fact, the presence of African Americans, Jews, and certain European immigrants was always described as a detrimental influence. In this project, we're going to estimate the causal effects of the federal redlining maps, taking advantage of an exogenous population threshold. In fact, only cities with at least 40,000 residents were mapped by this federal agency. Our effects are going to be identified using differences between neighborhoods in treated cities with a certain grades and areas that would have received the same evaluation if their city had been mapped. Now, to carry out this strategy, we're missing something, which is the grades in control cities. How are we going to deal with that? We're going to train a machine learning classification algorithm to replicate the original grade assignment. Once we have trained this algorithm, we can actually draw the maps in control cities. So once we have our own maps, we will apply a grouped difference in differences design to measure the short and long-term causal effects of the maps. And we're going to focus on 4 outcomes: homeownership rates, property values, rent prices, and shares of African-American residents. To carry out this strategy, we had to build our own data set. We started with the digitized redlining maps that we obtained thanks to the incredible work of a team at the University of Richmond. Then we are using the full count census between 1910 and 1940 that we geocoded using the addresses that are available in the proprietary version of Ancestry.com. To measure the long-term effects of the maps, we're using CoreLogic DITS data to measure property values. So that's a very granular source of data, while we have to rely on a more granular source of data to measure homeownership shares and shares of African-American residents. So we will have to use NAGIS tract level data for that. Great. So now I would like to give you a couple more details about the key steps in our empirical approach. And in our and the key step in our empirical approach is how are we going to replicate the redlining maps, such as this one, when we're starting with points. These are geocoded census records from the US 1930 census. So our solution here is to overlay a grid of regular hexagons over our census points. These hexagons are going to be our neutral definition of a neighborhood. They're fairly small. They're roughly the size of a New York City block. Once we have defined our neighborhoods, it's easy to aggregate individual level information and build a neighborhood level data set. It's particularly helpful to have a neighborhood level data set because what I would like to do now is to classify each of these hexagons into one of the 4 classes, either A, B, C, or D. And this is how I'm going to draw the redlining maps in the end. So the key step here is to have a classification model linking census variables to the observed grades. What are we going to use? We picked a random forest classification algorithm because of the very good level of precision that we could obtain thanks to its flexible, nonlinear, and non-parametric design. How are we measuring the performance of the random forest? We're following a standard procedure from the machine learning literature. So we're excluding a 25% random slice of the dataset from the training, so that when we test our algorithm, we can compare the predicted and the observed grade only on the excluded portion. So when we do this out of sample comparison, we find that we correctly classify 91.55% of our hexagons. So 91.55% is our overall level of precision. However, this number doesn't tell us much about any geographic patterns that our random forest might or might not capture. So how do the predicted maps look like? Let's see. So here on the left is the original map, the observed map for Baltimore in Maryland, while on the right is the map drawn by our random forest. We were satisfied with the overall level of compactness for the neighborhood shapes drawn by our prediction algorithm. That was not granted given the very small size of the spatial unit we were using. However, the final goal of this whole prediction exercise was not to draw the maps in treated cities, but to do that in control cities where a map did not exist. So how do the maps look like in control cities? Here are two examples, Queens, Illinois, and Colorado Springs, Colorado. We were happy to see that the random forest could predict even the green class. That's a very rare class, so it's not an easy task for the algorithm to pick that up. And again, we believe those neighborhood shapes are coherent with the shapes that we can find in the original federal redlining maps. All right, so hopefully I convinced you that we came up with a method for drawing the federal redlining maps using census data. What are we going to do with that? We're going to group observations using our predicted grades, and then we're going to impose a grouped diff-in-diff design to measure the causal effects both in the short term and in the long term. Since we're imposing a diff-in-diff framework, we would like to carry out the usual validity checks. I don't have time to show you the results for that. I will just say that the parallel trends assumption here is solid for 3 out of the 4 classes, B, C, and D, while it is weak for the top one. So the results for the A class should be taken with a good amount of skepticism. However, keep in mind that that class covers only 4% of our diff-in-diff dataset. Great, so it's finally time to show you the grade-specific results for the effect of the federal redlining maps. Now we start with the short-term results. And in particular, I'm going to start with the results for neighborhoods that were colored in red. In the short term, for these neighborhoods, we find a 2.4 percentage point reduction in homeownership rates, together with a 1.8 percentage point increase in the local percentage of African Americans. In these areas, we also find a sizable drop in property values, roughly $300, which corresponds to roughly an 8.5% drop with respect to the 1930 baseline. No effects on rent prices. Moving on to the yellow grade, here we find a smaller reduction on homeownership rates, but we do not find any effect of the yellow grade on the local percentage of African Americans. This is not surprising because Black Americans at the time were completely segregated in red neighborhoods. What is more surprising maybe is the sizable decrease, the sizable negative effect on property values for the yellow neighborhoods. However, we're not the first one to document this. Aronson, Hartley, Mazumder, in a previous paper with an alternative research design, they were the first to show negative effects of the yellow grade on property values. They even came up with a name for that. They call that yellow lining. And our results confirm their evidence. Again, no effect on rent prices, no effect of the blue grade on any of our outcomes of interest, and I will skip any comment on the effects of the top grade because of the weakness of the parallel trends assumption. Very quickly, long-term results. I only have time to show you the results for property values. If you're interested about the results for the other outcomes, you can find them in the paper, of course. Here, I'm showing the diff-in-diff coefficient for the long-term effects on property values for the lowest grade, the red grade. We binned data into 5 years intervals. So we start in 1965, we go up until 2005. We find negative effects of the lowest grade on property values up until the early 1980s. We find similar results for the yellow grade, while we do not find any long-term effects for the 2 top grades. Overall, Our results paint a slightly more conservative picture about the long-term effects of the maps on property values compared with what was available in the literature on this topic so far. To conclude, in the late 1930s, a federal agency started a nationwide survey of American neighborhoods guided by best practices in statistics, sociology, and economics. Less than 100 years later, this federal initiative has become a symbol of structural discrimination in the US public debate. In this project, we propose a new empirical approach to estimate the causal effects of the federal redlining maps. And I believe that our results provide empirical evidence that the maps had an economic effect, which in turn shows that an institution's acceptance and reproduction of discriminatory practices can have an economic effect. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Luca. And for the discussant, we have Professor Trevon Logan, and you have 15 minutes.
Thank you. I first want to thank the authors of these papers because they're very interesting set of papers, and they fall well within my wheelhouse in economic history, and so I'm very happy to think about them. What I want to talk about for the next couple of moments is actually not walking through each of these papers as sort of separate things, but thinking about them actually jointly as pieces of what I would call this sort of nexus between policy analysis and economic history, which we see a lot in the literature and which I think is very generative overall, and then really pushing the authors, both of their papers in a particular direction that I think would be even more useful for us, particularly outside of the academic space. So both of these papers really fall into what I would consider to be the cutting edge right now, which is persistent studies. So they're connected to, conceptually, what's really at the frontier of what's going on in this policy space, this applied macroeconomic space, and this economic history space. And so clearly the questions that they're asking are very important, but they're asking them and asking two very different questions, but about really very similar points in time in American history, right? So the first paper is looking at what happens to a local area's economy after you have the construction of this war-related manufacturing in these areas that themselves were sort of semi-protected by design for defense purposes, right? These are not places that we would think of as who would have exogenously sort of had a plant or would have naturally had a plant if you were thinking about where a business would have wanted to place a manufacturing establishment. And so we want to think about the long-term effects of such an intensive government investment in manufacturing industries. And then the second paper is thinking about what happens to residential areas that are redlined by the HOLC in the 1930s. And so I want to say a couple of things here to correct some of the things that Luca said in his presentation. One of the first is that although these redlining maps are very prominent in the literature today, it is not the case that African Americans were completely consigned to degraded areas. It was an important element into the grading of neighborhoods, but there are African Americans in C-graded neighborhoods, and even some in very rare instances in A-graded neighborhoods historically. But for the most part, race is actually one of the things, of course, that is leading to the assignment of these areas as being sort of hazardous. And that was actually the technical definition used at the time. The belief about credit access and in terms about credit access is really more institutional, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when we go to that. But both of these are really important questions if we're thinking about economic development in terms of manufacturing, and certainly if we're thinking about residential processes and neighborhood effects, and particularly access to credit, home ownership, of course, being a source of wealth, and how that would have differences and impacts on the racial wealth divide. So persistent studies always give us some great things, but they also have some detractions. The difficulty in a persistent study is it takes all of the tools of contemporary applied macroeconomics, and in particular sort of econometrics, and both of these papers use event studies, differences, to study these long-run impacts. And so I think what the papers have to face are both sort of the constraints of contemporary macroeconomics, applied macroeconomics, and then this other constraint that really is coming from history. And so what we see in the literature and what these papers do is they emphasize and really tackle one of these areas, and the second one, they don't put their arms around us fully, and I want to encourage them to do that. So what both of the papers tried to satisfy is what I call the Cambridge exclusion restriction. And by Cambridge, I'm not talking about a place in England, I'm talking about Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? So they're thinking about, can we think about these events, whether you're putting in that war-related plant, whether you're thinking about the HOLC sort of zoning area as sort of exogenous, right? And so that's answering the question of method of how can I actually get the causal impact of this thing on some long-term outcome. And then there is this other instance which comes from the narrative record, which is almost exactly sort of the opposite, right? Not thinking about these things as treatments and controls, but this sort of narrative historical sort of reaction to think about evolution and dynamic processes as opposed to sort of stark long-run impacts. In other words, thinking through more carefully in a more nuanced way about the ways that areas that are quote unquote treated or quote unquote untreated adjust to that treatment or being in the control group over time, leading itself to less necessarily of a causal effect as much more of a sort of a narrative. And obviously, of course, that would mean a story. So how does each paper address that method question, right? So both of these papers use matching, right? But they use them in different ways, right? So the first is we can think of that the counties that received manufacturing can be matched to other counties on observables, and then we can follow their sort of path forward, right? And so when you do this matching algorithm that's done in the paper, you can say, look, observationally, these counties that received and did not receive these manufacturing establishments are equivalent. And so we can think of the one who had the plan as being randomly assigned relative to the one who did not. And we can follow them through, and we can estimate under that assumption a treatment effect. And the second, what they're doing is they're exploiting the process by which neighborhoods were graded, right? And so what they can do is they not only are able to look within cities, which is where the current literature sort of stands, but they're able actually to look between cities and also to look at the effects of grading by different grades, right? A, B, C, and D. And what they're doing is they're exploiting that population threshold that led for there to be mapping in cities above a certain population and not below. And then you can take those cities that were redlined and use it and train the algorithm and then redline the cities that were not by definition redlined. And that's another form of matching, once again, to yield this causal estimate, because the only difference between the cities that are actually redlined and then the cities that were not redlined, now that you have this algorithm applied, is of course the population threshold. So how does each paper address that interpretation question, which we're talking about, that dynamic response? And so the papers are talking about mechanisms. And so I want to push them to think about these things further, and I'll have more to say about this shortly, is that the paper on the war-related establishments is thinking of the placement of these manufacturing places as leading to long-term demand for high-wage employment, and it's leading to more social mobility. Some of it's related to manufacturing. They sort of lay this out in their first figures in the paper. And then in the redlining paper, they're thinking about higher shares of Black residents into the future as a function of redlining, because they have these matched areas, and then lower property values in the lowest grade neighborhood. So this is something where the redlining process itself has effect on these outcomes. So some additional thoughts I have about the paper on war manufacturing establishments is to think really carefully about the substitution between manufacturing and the need for manpower in terms of military enlistment. So do we see an inverse relationship between enlistment rates by county and the placement size of manufacturing operations? One thing that the federal government had to solve was a really complex problem of needing people to literally fight the war, needing people to remain at home to participate in the manufacturing enterprise to, in fact, of course, support the war effort. But then there's a third source, which are the people who are providing basic goods and commodities, which are also in support of the war effort, but also in support of the population overall. So all of these things are coming into play, and I would like just a more nuanced discussion of how those things were being thought about by the people making the decisions of where to place these plants. And the second thing is, can we use sort of infrastructure as it existed in 1940? And I'm not sure, we didn't have a lot of national road building during the Great Depression, but one of the key things I think that would be obvious that you'd want to have for some of these manufacturing establishments is some existing infrastructure, or at least tentacles to infrastructure, because you're making these manufacturing establishments in places that you wouldn't traditionally think about, but you've got to connect them very easily to other sorts of places. So can we think about sort of railway establishments, some historical sort of railway establishments, other sorts of ways of thinking and developing counterfactuals that would exploit more sort of either natural or already construction infrastructure by the time of 1940. And then another question is, can we say something about gender, right? We know that women were employed in these manufacturing establishments, and the lack of results for gender was really interesting, but we know that women were substituting towards the war effort, right? And in places where there were these manufacturing establishments, I'm thinking of Taylor Jaworski's work, women are going into these plants, and later on they return to schooling much later, and that might be one of the reasons why you're not finding these long-run effects by gender. And so another question is just think about the intensive margin of what the economies look like in the places that had more manufacturing. And what I'm thinking about there is, can we say something about the distribution of wages in those places? Can we say something about the task distribution in those places and the occupational distribution in those places, right? So we have these sort of mean effects on things like wages, but I think what I'd really want to know about in these places is a little bit more about sort of variability and a more in nuanced discussion about variability more generally. The discussion in the paper talks a lot about unionization. And one of the issues for unionization I'm thinking about is, do we know something about unionization, right? So I know that Suresh Naidu and Ileana Kuzmenko have some work about sort of union density, and we're getting better information about union density, but do we have any evidence about union density in these places before the establishment of war manufacturing plants and after the establishment of manufacturing plants? And a lot of the focus here is on the long-term impacts of industrialization. But one of the things I noted is that that treatment effect goes negative for the years 1986 to 1990. And so these places might have had more manufacturing establishments in this golden era of the 20th century for the United States, but then that would make them more prone to be places for deindustrialization, or more prone to be places even in more recent years for those sort of WTO shocks that people have been using in the literature. So when we think about these long-term effects, I think you really will want to capture post-1990 long-term effects to think about that deindustrialization process, and also to think about sort of export competition today. Another question that I had about this was that in terms of those race effects, you do see a positive effect, for example, in Black male wages, but a really large and negative effect of the treatment on Black male employment. And so I'm thinking about the trade-offs that might exist between those two different margins, right, of some sort of economic variability and economic growth or mobility, because the employment effects, the disemployment effects, right, for Black men are 10 times the size of the effects that are estimated for white men. And the wage effects for Black men are estimated are only about 2 1/3, maybe 2 1/2 the size, right? So if I'm thinking about this trade-off of, extensive margin sort of employment versus intensive margin wages, that seems to be going in a very different direction there. So in terms of the paper on the HLC maps and some additional thoughts I have there, are there long-run changes along this discontinuity in terms of that population threshold, right? So are there other programs which used population thresholds that would be really important that we could think about as a check? One of the things that people and historians certainly have talked about, and economic historians have continued to talk about, is the fact that HLC maps and the later maps by the FHA, and I'll talk about this in a second, are all based upon maps that banks had much earlier on, right? So mapping locations and thinking about residential security in terms of the mortgage market is not something that the HOLC invented. And so we want to think about how the HOLC formalized a process that was already being practiced by private enterprise. Another question that I have about the maps is that the DC border has emerged as being particularly important relative to the CD border, and this is coming from the work that was cited in the presentation. But what I'm thinking about and reflecting on, if we're looking at this within cities, is that the BC border is the border in which you're thinking about neighborhoods transitioning, right? And some of these neighborhoods on the BC border transition and become predominantly African-American and have divestment and have, all these other situations that make them look very similar to degraded neighborhoods, and some of them don't. And so when we're thinking about why we might see more traction along one than not, that might really give some more credence to this empirical strategy about thinking about neighborhood transitions, because now we can look at those between cities, which I think is a really novel approach in this paper. And there are also several processes that are at play here that I think the paper is going to have to sort of just address or talk about. I'm thinking about things like African-American business ownership, thinking about de jure segregation, public goods, political maneuvering, suburbanization, et cetera, are you really thinking and arguing that all of these processes are going to be the same on both sides of that population threshold, because some of them do require different elements of scale? And so you want to think through really carefully what that algorithm is going to give you and what it's not. Another issue I think with the algorithm is, typically, if you're looking at an HOLC map, you have multiple red areas and multiple, say, yellow areas in a city. And so you'd want to make sure that you're mapping out, as you successfully think about these sort of segregated areas, that you're getting and replicating the number of predicted red areas or the number of predicted blue areas. And so there was this question, I think, really on the extensive margin for me about how many red areas should I predict in a city that's below the threshold versus how many I actually see. Also, regional differences. The population threshold and the process of sort of urban divestment could have been different on either side. And I think that it might be a different process for southern cities versus cities, for example, in the West or cities in the Northeast. And so some additional thoughts and extensions for both of these would be Gillian Burnett and Alexander Field have some work that are looking at World War II manufacturing. And I think that the paper actually has a lot of comments that it could give about that. Jacob Faber at NYU is doing some really novel work that is getting at this HOLC versus FHA divide and looking at the FHA and VA actual loans and individual loans and thinking about sort of the actual investment decisions that were made. HOLC was securitizing mortgages that already existed, but the FHA and the VA were issuing new mortgages. And I think drawing more from the narrative record in general is always going to aid and is always a good strategy. So, the bigger issue I'm wanting to think about when we think about these sort of persistence studies is a question that neither one of these papers has to answer, but I think is just an important question that we want to ask as a discipline, which is, under what conditions should we expect policy persistence, and under what conditions should we not expect policy persistence? And that's really important because we want to have more nuanced discussions about adaptation, targeted, non-targeted areas, and the like. So thank you.
Thank you for that discussion. It's really interesting. And so for the final bit, we are going to turn to Fabian to give him an opportunity to discuss Zaire's presentation, and then we will open it up for any questions that we have with the remaining few minutes. So, Fabian, thank you.
Yep, and I'll be quick because I think we're also running out of time for the general Q&A. The paper, I think, is sort of a beginning of a project which sounds really exciting. There is indeed I think an urgent need for us to think about how to quantitatively measure structural racism and how to estimate its effects. And I think the authors sort of are starting to spell out a couple of different perspectives. And I will just say that what's common to these perspectives, of course, is that in many ways, all three dimensions or topics they look at, health, racial inequality, and wealth also, are cumulative and are therefore interactive over long periods of history. And with that, quite hard to study, I would say. The one approach that I just want to sort of push the authors to consider that I find really, really hopeful is a new or forthcoming piece in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior that pushes exactly in this direction. It's by Nick Gratz, Courtney Bone, and Michael Esposito. That also shows us, one way sort of is to throw up our hands and say, well, these are long-standing historical processes, although you've just seen in the last two presentations and the discussing comments, how we can very carefully quantitatively estimate the long-term effects of historical events and inequalities. But the issue, of course, becomes once you look at it dynamically across several dimensions, how racism shapes wealth and how wealth shapes health, and reversely, one, I think, understandable response for could be is to say, throwing up your hands, that we cannot estimate the effects of racial inequality in the same way that we're accustomed to estimating a policy effect. And I think that would be too fast to do that. So there are quantitative approaches that really take that seriously. They're sort of embedded within a sort of broader life course mediation decomposition framework that you could as well apply to sort of a more historical as opposed to life course view. And I think that Journal of Health and Social Behavior article, it's called Structural Racism and Quantitative Causal Inference, a life course mediation framework for decomposing racial health disparities, is doing quite a bit of what the authors are sort of pushing for. And I would just encourage them to check out that work and continue their journey on that important paper.
Great, thank you. So the Q&A portion is open. So if any of the attendees or audience members wants to ask a question, feel free. And also while we're waiting on those questions, if any of the panelists have questions for any of the other panelists, feel free to ask each other. I know one of the things that's often frustrating about presenting on these panels, it can be hard for the questions, the panelists to ask each other questions. So I want to provide that space for folks to be able to do that as well. Okay, still not seeing any questions asked. I'll just give them another few seconds to ask questions, but considering we're towards the end of the session, if we don't get any questions, we can just go ahead and end a little early. So just any final question, any questions from folks in the audience? Last call. Okay, seeing none. I want to thank the presenters today for such really interesting papers and for the discussants for really thoughtful commentary. We'll hope that you'll be able to join us for some future sessions. I think there's a really fascinating plenary coming up tomorrow with Sandy Darity and others. And so, or it's that Wednesday, I'm forgetting the days, but that we have some really interesting sessions and plenaries coming up in the next couple of days. So we hope you're able to join us for some of the following sessions. If you have additional questions for the presenters, feel free to follow up with them individually. And if you have questions about the rest of the conference, see our event page or email events@equitablegrowth.org. Thank you again for coming and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.